25 Cromwell Street, Gloucester, home to Fred and Rose West and their 9 children. Outside, an ordinary family home. Inside, the scene of some of the most horrific crimes in British history.
I had both these faces hovering over me. And they said, "We're going to kill you, and we're going to bury you under the paving stones of Gloucester."
A house of utter depravity, which shocked even the toughest investigators.
And it was obvious as a human thigh bone, and female and young.
Officers searching 25 Cromwell Street have today discovered what they believe to be another set of human remains.
You are facing something that you have never, ever seen before, and you really don't want to see it.
This is the true story of Fred and Rose West. The 24th of February, 1994. The last night Fred and Rose would spend together after 22 years of marriage, and the start of a murder investigation that would shock the world. Fred West, a builder in his 50s, worked hard to pay for his house in the centre of Gloucester, where he lived with his devoted wife Rose and their children.
These were people who were well regarded. I mean, they weren't highly regarded, but at least well regarded by most of those around them. A bit eccentric, a bit odd, but do anything for you.
Summer 1969. Rose was waiting for a bus when Fred first saw her. She was almost 16, and Fred was 28. Fred tracked Rose down to the cafe where she waitressed. Thick-set and strong, the son of a farm labourer, Fred got his way with the women he pursued. Soon, Rose was Fred's lover, and pregnant with their first daughter, Heather. Over 20 years later, and Heather had been missing for 7 years. Allegations of sexual abuse within the West family alerted Gloucestershire police to Heather's disappearance. After an initial search failed to locate her, Detective Superintendent John Bennett was brought in to investigate.
What that basically meant was that either she had gone abroad illegally because she wouldn't have had a passport, or was dead.
The police search quickly centred on the West's house in Cromwell Street.
It was some form of a family joke that Heather was under the patio at Cromwell Street. This being mentioned mostly by Fred and Rose West to their children when they'd done something wrong, hadn't eaten their food or refused to go to bed or been naughty in some way.
On the 24th of February, the police moved in to search Fred West's garden.
He was saying that there was no truth in this and that he was going to sue the police for the damage they were causing to his home.
Slab by slab, the police removed Fred's patio. They found nothing at first. Then, digging deeper, something caught their eye. It was a bone, but was it human? They called in forensic pathologist Professor Bernard Knight to find out.
And it was obvious that, 2 seconds it was a human thigh bone, and female and young. Fred had broken a sewer pipe at some stage in his digging. So I was digging through a mixture of Gloucester clay and of course the sewage, so it was a sort of black, sticky mess. But then when I went into this hole, or at least I think there's a police officer down there, and he handed up some bits. And I looked at these. I remember looking, I think, at Inspector Bennett and saying, well, either she's got 3 legs or you got more than one.
The police had found the remains of 2 bodies. They suspected one was Heather, but who else was under the patio? The police confronted Fred. Fred made a staggering confession. Not only Heather, but 2 other women were buried in the garden. One had a name. He said she was Shirley Robinson, his secret lover. and pregnant with his child.
The thing I want to stress, is Rose doesn't know anything at all. She hasn't done anything.
The other, he claimed, was Shirley's mate. The police needed more information, but Fred kept changing his story.
One minute he was making admissions, the next minute he was denying that he had done any of these murders and it was somebody else.
She's not going to let me say to her, I strangled Heather, without coming straight to the police. Don't get Rose wrong. Rose lived by the law. Properly, I mean.
But all the time, whenever he returned to making his admissions, he would reinforce that his wife knew nothing of these crimes at all, that they were purely down to him.
Was it possible that Rose knew nothing about the murders? 3 young women killed and buried under her nose, including her daughter Heather. Cromwell Street was turning out to be no ordinary family home, but a house of unimaginable horrors. In 1994, one of the biggest criminal investigations in Britain began in an ordinary house in Gloucester. The remains of 3 young women had been recovered from under the patio at 25 Cromwell Street. One of the victims, Heather, was the teenage daughter of builder Fred West, who'd confessed to all 3 murders. Now, Fred had started to change his story. But in one thing he was consistent. His wife, Rose, knew nothing about the murders.
I know she doesn't like the law, but she'll not have it broken.
He even started to converse with the officers off tape, almost suggesting that he wasn't guilty of murder, he was guilty of manslaughter, that he would be out soon, that this would all be some big tragic accident that he would portray.
Was this a case of manslaughter, as Fred claimed, or were his quick confessions masking something far more sinister? Evidence found with a 3rd victim pointed to murder.
One of them had a black plastic or leather belt with a buckle, again put round under the chin and over the top of the head. Of course, because all the soft tissues had gone, everything had sort of moved a bit and fallen about, but it was obvious that this was some kind of bondage thing on the head.
But who was the 3rd victim? All the police knew was what Fred had told them. She was the friend of his secret lover, Shirley Robinson, the 2nd victim found at Cromwell Street.
It was obvious it was going to be hard to identify these bodies because the bones themselves never give you any clue as to who the person is, not the bones. Usually it's the face, the skull and the teeth. And of course that's the province of Professor Whittaker.
There is more information in your teeth about you and your lifestyle and your age and possibly even how you died than there is in most other parts of your body, especially if the body is decomposed and the soft tissues are gone and the teeth are still there.
To help the police, Professor Whittaker needed photographs of likely victims.
Providing we can get a photograph of them smiling and showing their teeth, those teeth have an incredible amount of information in them in terms of height, tilt, roundedness, all of these which will show up in a good photograph. And so we assess those in the laboratory and then we sort of fuse simply a photograph that comes in to me from the police with an image of the person's skull. And if we've got it right, it sort of goes click.
But how could the police provide photographs when they didn't have a name for one of the victims? Unsolved missing persons files were reopened. Names began to emerge. Winter 1968. Mary Bastholm, a young waitress, went missing from a bus stop in Gloucester. 5 years later, a young student, Lucy Partington, vanished from another bus stop, this time in nearby Cheltenham. Was it possible one of them was the third victim buried at Cromwell Street? Or could they both be there? Forensic psychologist Paul Britton was brought in to profile Fred West and answer the burning question, were there other victims?
I was in a position where I had paperwork that went back 20, 30 years. And as I began to look at that, then the bells began to ring rather grimly for me. Because what I began to see were some of the hallmarks, the highlights of a very dangerous offender. Not at all the man that I'd been told might be sitting downstairs. My view was that all that had happened is you had simply seen 3 high points, and that it was very unlikely, unthinkable really, that you were going to have silences across the intervening years. The time between those 3 marks was going to be filled with other sorts of murder, other sorts of killing.
A man will appear in court this morning following the discovery of 3 bodies in his back garden. 52-year-old Fred West from Gloucester is accused of murdering the women, including his 16-year-old daughter Heather, who disappeared in 1987.
I listened to the news and I just went straight back to 1972, and I was there again, and I remembered those words, you know, bury me under the paving stones. There was hundreds of girls, and I thought paving stones, patio, same thing.
Caroline Roberts looked after Heather when she worked for the Wests as a nanny. Deeply disturbed by news of her death, she rang the police to offer a statement.
That night I couldn't sleep at all. I knew the police were coming in. I was trying to remember all the things that I took 22 years trying to forget. And it was so vivid that in the end I had to get up in the middle of the night and I just wrote everything down. It was haunting for me because I really felt responsible for their deaths. It was almost like they were my family. I knew them all intimately, and I think that's because I know up to a point I shared the same experience as them.
Another call to the police, this time from a friend of the parents of Linda Gough, a girl who had gone missing in 1973 and whose last known address was 25 Cromwell Street. New information started to emerge.
During the course of looking for her, Mrs. Gough had gone to the address and been told by a woman and her husband, Linda had left some time previously.
Linda's mother had noticed that Rose was wearing her daughter's slippers. If this was the case, and Linda was one of Fred's victims, it was possible Rose knew about the murders.
He was also wearing a cardigan or some knitted clothing that was Linda's, and outside on a whirligig type washing line was some of Linda's nightwear.
The Wests told Mrs. Gough that Linda had moved on, leaving some of her things behind. Believing their story, but unable to locate Linda, June Gough waited for her daughter's return. Years went by, but Linda never came back. Caroline Roberts first met the Wests 6 months before Linda moved in. In her statement to the police, Caroline recalled in chilling detail how the Wests selected their potential victims.
This one night I was hitchhiking back from Tewkesbury on my own, and this car pulled up with 2 people in, and this was Fred and Rose West. When I first got in there, I didn't think they were a couple because of the age difference and the fact that she was quite an attractive young girl and he was not an attractive man. As we went on our way back towards Cinderford, we got talking and they seemed really friendly, and that's when I found out they just got married and that they had 3 little girls. And they were talking to me and asking me about what I was doing and that, and I said that I tried to avoid being at home as much as possible because my stepdad, we kind of just didn't get on.